Today, we're going to be discussing how green finance models can provide the necessary funds for net zero residential builds and for retrofits. How can the green finance models that many of our panelists here today are working on help to reduce the high upfront costs for homeowners and for borrowers, provide that capital that we need to reach our net zero goals? I'm Ryan Jude, Built Environment Programme Director at Green Finance Institute. For those who aren't aware, GFI is a non-profit organisation that works with government and with industry to develop green finance solutions for those real economy outcomes, such as retrofitting our buildings. You'll also see that I'm also a cabinet member at Westminster City Council. So I'm also seeing this at the coalface, but very much talking about the green finance aspects today. Just to very briefly set the scene before my panellists introduce themselves, the Committee on Climate Change's 7th carbon budget has said that we're going to need investment to the tune of £373 billion to retrofit our built environment by 2050. The new government has gone big on their warm homes plan, their 1.5 million new build targets, their energy mission, their growth mission, and I'm hoping that that will help to create the economic environment that we need to see that capital start to move, because the CCC also said that the vast majority of that investment needs to come from industry and from private finance. So our panel today are going to tell you about how we're going to do that and what all the answers are to start to move that money. So if I turn to my panel, if you could please just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about your role in helping to finance the greening of our built environment. And Pete, if I could start with you, please.
Thanks, Ryan. Great to be here. Hope everyone can hear me okay. Slightly surreal. So Pete Level, Group Managing Director of Public Investments at Legal & General. That means me and my team work across the different pools of money within Legal & General, both our own internal balance sheet investment, but also we've got a £90 billion annuity book that's millions of people's pensions who pay out every month. The only person who pays out more every month is the NHS. So we are literally talking about millions of people in the public receiving money from that annuity book. And then increasingly co-investors and particularly local government pension schemes. So the team and I work across those different pools of money, identifying the social need for investments, particularly focused on the UK. And to cut to the chase, this is one of the areas that we see real potential to grow. There are other areas where we've deployed billions of pounds, for example, in partnership with the Cabinet Office, funding all of their new hubs to enable the civil service to move out of London. Would be a recent example in the last few years. That's a £1.4 billion programme. But there are areas like this where we just see there's huge social potential in terms of the impact addressing fuel poverty, but also obviously the huge environmental potential. And fundamentally, this should be an investment that works for long-term patient investment because it generates long-term savings. And if we can capture some of those savings and use them to pay people's pensions, we can invest those pensions into the works upfront. So pretty simple model. The devil is obviously in the detail, and look forward to discussing that later.
Great. Thanks, Pete. Really important point you said there is that there is real potential to grow. And I think that's one thing that everyone needs to realise, that a lot of the investors see this as an investment opportunity. So we've heard from the pension sector. If I could turn now to a lender, Tracy, if you wouldn't mind also introducing yourself and saying the work you're doing.
Sure. And as Pete said, this is super surreal being up here and not really being able to hear anything else. So I'm Tracy Callahan and I lead the innovation work stream for climate data at NatWest. And we've been very much focused on improving the data quality needed to push forward the transition. And that's not only from sort of a regulatory perspective, because we have to do our annual disclosures, our sustainability disclosures, but also so we can improve our understanding and ultimately better serve our customers. To give you sort of a bit of a feel for what that looks like, we've been very much focused on understanding the issues to date and raising awareness as well. So both from a customer standpoint and also with government in terms of policy. We're part of the Sustainable Homes and Buildings Coalition, which did one of the first sort of retrofit projects sort of 4 years or so ago now, trying to identify what the key barriers were to retrofit. And I should probably say as well that the NatWest mortgage book is around 1.3 million properties and about £210 billion worth of lending. That equates to about 2.8 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent for our portion of lending to those homes. And we have an ambition to halve that by 2030 and ultimately be net zero by 2050. So focus very much on how we can shift that transition.
Thank you, Tracy. So we've heard from the finance institutions, and now to turn to those who are helping to do the development and do the building. So Simon, from an architect's perspective, it'd be great to hear about the work that you're up to as well.
Thanks very much. I'm an architect involved in helping to build and rebuild the built environment. And I'm very interested in this idea of innovative financial models, because we always say if you want to make better buildings, you need better ways of financing and measuring the cost of them. So for instance, at present, we cost buildings as an outturn cost. We don't cost them as a life cycle cost. So lots of things I'm looking forward to learning more about today. The challenges as I see them is we have a new build world that's highly regulated, that's getting more and more challenging and more expensive. We have a refurbishment world that's ever more necessary but made more difficult because the new build world, highly regulated, makes the old housing stock theoretically less valuable. We have a planning system that makes it challenging to transform existing buildings and challenging to make new buildings because it is generally slow. We live in a dynamic world of embodied and operational carbon. 10 years ago, we didn't really talk about embodied carbon, we talked about operational carbon. As the grid gets greener, we're moving back to embodied carbon as a much bigger story, because theoretically, if energy was green, we would worry less about things. So that's a massive changing tipping point, yet we build buildings that should last, really in today's world, forever, which is quite challenging. So while planning will talk about zones of uses, we should really think about all buildings being able to accommodate different uses in the future. We of course need to think about husbandry and carbon and how we leave our planet in a better place. But this rate of change, I think, is the biggest challenge. We have a cladding bill, which we're dealing with. We have a high-risk building bill, which we're dealing with. And we have a net zero bill. So these are all big financial problems. I think one of the interesting things when you talk about housing is statistics are sort of everywhere and nowhere. As someone I know who's very involved in this often says, we have enough housing in this country to deal with the shortage. We just have it in the wrong places. So infrastructure could perhaps help change that. We also have a finance model that kind of penalizes you for moving house. So in fact, we have, sounds terrible, but lots of people using housing stock that isn't inappropriate for their needs. And we need to kind of create models to allow them to leave that housing stock for others, almost incentivize them to downsize or upsize and these different kind of things. So these are all challenges that we face. The biggest kind of overall view I have is whatever we're doing with new stock or old stock or finance models to change it, we need to recognize we're in a dynamic world, and whatever we're building should be, despite the circular economy and rebuilding, it should be adaptable for future change to other things. So the pressure of money is make us build leaner and tighter, but the pressure of the future should make us build looser. The famous saying is long life, loose fit, low energy. So I haven't got all the solutions, but I've thrown up some of the challenges that we all have to work on. It's exciting, but it's definitely tricky.
Great, thank you very much, Simon. Lots of points raised there that I'm sure we'll come back to in the Q&A around regulation, around planning issues, around incentives. How do we get them all in the right place to enable the retrofit and the new builds that we need to see? Last but not least, I'm delighted to be joined by Tarek Kazi, who is going to bring us the social housing perspective.
Thank you very much. I'm very, very glad to be here. So I am a former corporate banker turned corporate treasurer. The organization I work for is a housing association called Peabody Trust, which has been in London and surrounding areas for 163 years. The organization today has a portfolio of 109,000 homes, revenue of £1 billion, and pays £240 million interest to investors and lenders. So people the likes of Pete and NatWest, Tracy, and others as well. My job is to raise the financing to give the organization the capital it needs, essentially to grow its housing stock. So my job is meant to be to borrow new money in order to build new homes. Over the last 10 years, however, because of some of the things that Simon has mentioned, in particular 3 different challenges we've faced, and that is addressing building safety, especially because of the learnings coming out of the Grenfell tragedy not far from here, addressing stock condition, not least because of the findings of a coroner's inquiry in a northern part of the country, Rochdale, and not least because of the overwhelming need to deliver carbon savings or carbon efficiency by 2030 to reach a certain level of efficiency, and by 2050 to get to net zero. What I'm finding is that my job is becoming about how to raise money in partnerships with long-term investors, with lenders and others, in ways that we can deliver retrofit improvements, new green homes, and so on. What we're finding at the moment is the interest rate environment, where interest rates have risen over the last 3 years from about 2% to about 6%, is making it all very, very challenging for us. However, why is social housing very important in this? Social housing across the country, up and down the country, represents about 4 million homes in charitable ownership. As a sector, if we get our act together and organize ourselves, working with the operators and the financiers, we present a proof case such that we can hopefully deliver at scale the kind of changes that need to happen in the wider ownership of housing stock up and down the country. I'm very interested to see what questions come out of the conversation, but back to you, Ryan.
Thank you very much, Tarek. Just a reminder, all of you, please do scan the QR code to send your questions in. You could also upvote questions that are already in there, so it helps me choose what it is that the most popular questions are. And thanks to everyone who's already started to submit them. Just give you all a bit more time to think of a few questions. A quick one from me to all of the panelists, and you all alluded to this in your opening remarks, but nationally and internationally, we're seeing a very changing political environment. You know, we've seen the new government in the UK commitments from the US and from other countries. We've seen climate falling down on the list of priorities. So I guess the question to you is, how is the current political climate domestically and internationally starting to impact your role and your sector? If we start at Pete and then work our way back.
Yeah. I mean, I think in some ways I welcome what's been happening, because ESG had become such a kind of bandwagon that every investor and his dog was jumping on, and it was hard to distinguish who was actually cared about the impact they were having on the planet or people's lives, and who was just kind of chucking a slide in at the end of their PowerPoint deck and ticking some boxes. So I think a bit of a kind of sorting of the wheat from the chaff, and being clear that this isn't just about kind of having an ESG label, but actually about improving people's lives and homes, is really welcome. And actually, when you cut down to what you really mean when you invest in this kind of thing, it's rare to find a politician on this side of the pond or the other side of the pond who really disagrees with improving people's homes, reducing damp, reducing their fuel bills. Some may have a bit of a question on the carbon bit, I'll give you that. But my point is, fundamentally, there are many reasons to do this, and it's about kind of moving away from some trite, sound clips, to actually getting down to the reality of the change that your investment will make, especially when we can partner with people like Peabody and other local authorities and housing associations. So yeah, I think the other change that we have seen happening and will welcome more of is an increasing role of local authorities and combined authorities, and government trusting both of those entities with freedom to actually retrofit their own stock, to move less from a kind of dribs and drabs of grants that pop out occasionally, where everyone kind of clambers and competes with each other for the latest pot of £5 million, to longer term settlements. And the mood music, I'm not going to betray any confidences on a stage, but the mood music out of Number 10 and Treasury is increasingly going in that direction from my perspective, that they want to see local authorities work hand in glove with sources of patient capital in a much longer term basis to really drive the change that's needed. We'll never do that sporadically with bits and bobs, which was some of the old world. So I actually see a lot of things in.
Great, thanks, Pete. Briefly, with my local authority hat on, we would also very much appreciate that long-term ability to think and to plan how we can finance our own stock. Tarek.
So leading on one of my other experiences, wearing a different hat, I'm a council member of the Association of Corporate Treasurers. When I speak with the corporate treasurers who operate in the private sector, who have quarterly earnings targets, chief executives, CFOs, boards, who are driven to deliver according to the current rules of the game, inevitably they feel pressure to respond to messaging coming out of the US. So slightly against their own wishes and long-term judgment, they find that engaging in green financing, sustainably linked loans and such like is not just a bit of a chore, it's actually actively being discouraged in some very large private sector organizations. We've seen the chair of a global oil company change at pretty short notice in the last few weeks. That's the kind of pressure that they face. When I'm in that kind of setting and I bring a different perspective, which is from a non-shareholder organization which makes 30-year financial plans and starts doing climate resilience modeling based in London on the impact of the Thames flooding up to a certain level or beyond that to another level, what impact it means for the homes that we own and manage, and conversely, what impact there is of overheating our homes in hot summers on, frankly, mortality rates in our homes. We take that very, very seriously.
Yeah.
And I've been encouraged that over the last few weeks, we're seeing more messaging coming out of DESNZ, UK government and others, talking about clean energy, talking about climate resilience, talking about net zero and carrying on, staying the course. So I think it's going to be a tough journey, but it's inevitable. We have to address it. We have to address climate change and climate resilience.
Yep, absolutely agree. It's not going to be easy, but we have to do it, and that's why we're all here trying to figure it out today, how we can all work together to move it forward. Simon, could I come to you next, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't disagree with anything that's been said. I don't think it's easy. I think there is also a danger in the UK that we turn it into a kind of religious experience. We need to be critical of what we are doing now because the world is changing very rapidly. The rate of change to a green economy will not be as fast as governments were saying 2 or 3 years ago. 2030 targets will change. And I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. I think it's realistic. We need to also think about the fact that there is a slight danger. We only design to what we can measure. So we can measure carbon. We can't measure happiness. Well, these kinds of things. The pressure of money is, I think, forcing us to build super lean, too tight, and we need to build slightly more generous and more flexible. We're in a post-COVID world, but we're in a changing world of work. I think people should still go to offices and go to schools and go to universities as physical places, but the buildings we're building could get too tailored by the green economy to make them economically affordable. And we need to have another idea that we're sort of building long-term assets for future generations in a dynamic carbon model that will keep changing because the politics of Russia invading Ukraine will change our attitude to oil for a period of time. So we need to kind of have a long-term, clearer, bigger picture against which we pitch the 5-year plans. I heard the word patient finance, which I think is essential for that. But as people who are thinking about where we're going, I think we don't think enough about things like infrastructure and how that can liberate housing stock that we're not using very well. We don't have enough big picture strategies, in my opinion, and we're all working in our little field, aware of the other fields around us. But, government needs to help think bigger, longer term strategic views on this.
Thank you, Simon. Tracy.
Yeah, I guess when I was thinking about this question, being a UK focused bank, we don't bear the brunt of it like a lot of people do. Obviously, there's still pressure there, and we are seeing climate becoming more and more politicised. However, I think everything we do, we kind of tie back to our customers, and ultimately for them, many of them, it's not their number one priority, whether that's climate, whether it's politics. Their number one priority is focusing on their day to day, that how much their energy bills are costing, that kind of thing. So there's still that recognition, that pull, that demand from the customer base. So that's very much what we're focusing on. Our Green Homes Attitude Tracker, which we run 2 times a year, there's some positive news in there. So the last one we ran, 65% of respondents said they were planning some form of efficiency improvement to their property in the next decade. Slightly lower, but still quite optimistic. 22% said that they were planning some kind of efficiency improvement in the next 12 months. So it's that kind of thing that I guess is more where we're focused on, is how we meet that demand. Another thing that's highlighted is the need for reduced complexity. At the moment, it's very much case-by-case basis. So we've got a program called the Home Energy Hub with a home energy plan, which is open to anyone. You don't have to be a NatWest customer, which takes people on that end-to-end journey, right from the initial plan through to installers of technology, because that we saw a need for that within the market. Ultimately, though, cost remains the number one barrier. And again, our survey that we do on twice yearly showed that 71% of respondents who aren't planning on taking out any action cited the upfront cost barrier as being the number one thing that stopped them from taking action. In terms of innovative financing, though, we're trying to, how do you shift the dial? How do you make it make sense for people? So some of the stuff we've been working on is property-linked finance with GFI and with Lloyds, looking at how can you tie the debt to the property rather than the owner, and that really is aimed to help address this payback barrier that you have. So if, for example, you're living in a property and you know that a retrofit is going to take 7 to 10 years to deliver any kind of return, if you're planning on moving in the next 3 to 5 years, you're just not even going to entertain it. It just doesn't make sense for you. So it's aimed sort of where to fill in that gap that could help people get cheaper lending than they would through unsecured means, but also where perhaps additional borrowing isn't an appropriate mechanism. In addition to that, we've been looking at sort of how do you layer incentives. So we know that there's government grant schemes. Is cashback incentives, 0% finance, although interestingly Nationwide found that there was a real lack of interest in their 0% finance offerings. With any other kind of cashback generated through perhaps carbon credits or something like that. How do you layer these things up that it starts to make sense for people? And a current piece of work that we're doing is a survey to try and test out different scenarios to see what actually starts to shift the dial in this space, what is motivating for people.
Thank you, Tracy. Can highly recommend the NatWest Green Home Attitudes Tracker. If you've not looked it up, do give it a Google. And property finance is a model that we've been developing with NatWest for a couple of years now, and we do think it to be a real game changer. We've seen it mobilise billions in other countries, so do look at the GFI's reports on that if you want to learn more. Right, I'm going to turn to the many questions that are now flooding in on the Slido. Tarek, the first one, the most upvoted one, is about social housing. So if I turn to you first, and then anyone else, do please feel free to come in. What are some of the pain points that you're seeing in retrofitting social housing?
There are several challenges to retrofitting at scale, and especially in social housing. So the challenge that's common to anyone, no matter what tenure and what kind of properties you own, is the supply chain and the technology. That's still being tested and proven. Are air source heat pumps a good idea or a bad idea? The jury's still out on one kind of solution or another. For social housing, we've got 2 additional challenges that we're working to overcome. One is we are retrofitting around residents who are in situ. So can we retrofit by decanting a resident and then recanting them back in? Or do we retrofit while they're living in the property? Or do we wait for properties to come void as and when tenures and tenancies change? So that's challenge number 1. Challenge number 2 is that unlike any other investor, our rental income does not adjust for the money that we spend on retrofitting. So we could spend £25,000 on improving the energy efficiency of a home valued at £75,000. We would earn a return only on the £75,000 that we invested way back, not on the additional £25,000. And that money is subsidizing the tenant's fuel bill, that tenant's fuel bill, by taking money away from all of the other tenants that we have to support. So we've got some fundamental challenges we've got to work around.
And yet, I think for us, as seeking to fund the retrofit of social housing, it's been quite a journey. That's probably the understatement of the year. The first point has been working up innovative financial models. We've got three, I'd say, were innovative. One, which is just lending to a housing association, is less innovative. But three different innovative models we can go into more detail if helpful, and particularly try to address Tarek's point around how you tap into some of the fuel bill savings to make the initial investment, upfront investment work, whilst absolutely critically ensuring there's a real substantial fuel bill saving, because obviously that's a huge amount of the social impact. If I was to put my finger on one pain point at the moment, it's the gap between the round table and reality. There are countless round tables that we will sit at with government or different owners of social housing, people like the GFI who do absolutely fantastic work. The last thing this is about is criticising the GFI, because they are pulling the industry together in terms of making this happen. But there's a huge gap from the theory of a model to actually deploying it in 2,000 social homes, scoping out the scheme of works for each home, making sure each tenant will be better off as a result. As Tarek says, all the work around the scheme of works and decanting, etc. So all of that requires a huge amount of upfront investment. Obviously, someone like Legal & General can't make that investment unless we know we're actually going to be the investor at the end. And it's quite hard for a local authority to do that when they don't have sight to an end investor. So that's the gap at the moment. That's the critical pain point. We have partnerships with a couple of local authorities where we've kind of said on trust, we will plough six-figure amounts into trying to close that gap. But that's all done on trust and as a result of relationships and a desire to have a positive impact together. There's no contractual backing to any of that, and it does make a real difference.
Great, thanks, Pete. I couldn't agree more on the difference between talking about the problem and actually delivering. And events like this are obviously brilliant, so you can all hear what's happening, but what we're really interested in at GFI is how do we actually implement it and start to see that change. The next one then is the top voted is, what's the impact on value if we take no action? So what's the cost of inaction? Should financing models take that into account? I don't know which one of you wants to come in first on this. Simon?
I mean, I'll just talk a little bit about the challenge in this retrofit or new build. For instance, there's a thing called passive house, which a lot of you will know about, which is about reducing energy usage and pouring a lot of embodied energy into a building to make it very airtight and sealed. In the world of offices, we've dramatically changed in the market the perception of what is deemed comfort. So offices used to run at a standard 21-degree air conditioning system. They now run at a variable temperature that recognizes that people seasonally change their clothes. I think we're pouring everything into buildings without thinking about maybe some cultural changes. If you go back 100 years, you had seasonal clothing. Suits were much heavier than they are now. Everything is super fine and light. I'm not, literally, we've brought a temperature of everything up to actually, I think, an unhealthy level that leads to microbes in carpets and everything else. So I think we need to think a bigger picture about what is the appropriate action in a building and what is the appropriate action in how we live all our lives, because we've set a new standard that we all think we need to achieve, which most set tests will tell you the way we heat our environments in terms of the quality of air and the kind of microbes in clothes and furniture is too high. So we need a bit of a reset on that, and it's not necessarily chucking it into buildings. It's encouraging new ways of thinking about what is appropriate comfort. I am not talking here about pensioners being frozen. I'm just talking about finding a new balance that recognises it's not all done by buildings, it's done by people.
Anyone else want to come in on the value of inaction and how financing models could potentially factor that in?
I can go back to the example that I mentioned earlier, which is on some sort of statistical or probabilistic basis over a 50-year period, we could model, and of course everyone is going to have a view on the assumptions, we could model the increase in mortality rates in homes in central London due to higher summertime temperatures. The modelling exists because it was seen in France over the last couple of decades. There would be extrapolation involved. It might not be very accurate. And then we've got to agree, how do we put a financialized or measurable value on future longevity, on quality of life, and bring that back into today's financial models? Not easy at all, but we can predict how the future might unfold.
Thanks, Eric. Tracy?
Yeah, I was going to say it's a really tricky one because it's a little bit intangible for people to kind of get to grips with. So when we did our retrofit pilot with the Sustainable Homes and Buildings Coalition, post that piece of work, one of the things that consistently came out as one of the major benefits of doing retrofit was comfort. Everyone cited it as that was their number one thing that they were most impressed with, how better their home held heat, how quicker it was to warm up, all that kind of good stuff. Yeah, it was not cited as a reason for doing any of the work up front. So it's a really tricky one. I'm not sure how we kind of get the message out around things like co-benefits. On the value piece as well, in terms of like property value, it's something we've been considering with our Coots, our private bank within NatWest, where actually the saving on bills isn't a massive motivator for perhaps those that are a bit more wealthy, and actually increasing the value of their home and seeing it as a bit more of an investment in their property as well.
Great, thanks, Tracy. Next question then. So there's a lot of talk at the minute around minimum energy efficiency standards. How do we drive EPC improvements? How can financial incentives and levers be used to drive EPC improvements by landlords to the benefits of renters? Who wants to come in on this?
I can give you a short answer for social housing. We have to be EPC-C across our entire portfolio by 2030. If we're not, and if the rules stay as they are, then we'll be unable to rent those properties out. So they'll have zero value. But I think the bigger change is probably going to come from the retail sector and the residential mortgages.
That was a nice segue. I mean, there's a lot of change happening in the EPC space at the moment. We had the EPC reform consultation at the beginning of the year. We're expecting another one. It's supposed to be this year on the home energy model, which is going to replace the RDSAP calculation methodology. You can tell I'm a data person. That was the kind of bit that sort of really interested me. So I think at the moment it's a bit. We've done our own analysis internally, and I know likes of the Smart Energy Research Lab have done similar, that just points towards EPC being hugely inaccurate when it comes to things like calculating the efficiency, particularly when it comes to energy consumption of a property. I mean, the figures are absolutely wild, and to be fair to EPC, it was never really designed for this purpose. It was designed to give people an indication how much it would cost to run a home. So it's that kind of disparity between the quality of the data and all the changes that are coming in at the moment is something we're kind of sitting back and contributing to, but hoping for some positive changes in that space.
Great, thanks, Tracy. There's an interesting question that's just come in around adaptation. Simon, I wonder if I could turn to you first on this one. So we talked a lot about energy efficiency here, about carbon, about the financing of that, but increasingly we're obviously seeing the impacts of the already level of warming that we've seen, flooding, overheating. So how are you factoring that in to your work? And then to the others afterwards, how are you looking to finance this?
You will never not get new buildings. If you look at the social history of new towns, it's been a difficult struggle to make new places. So for me, people talk about brownfield development. I am very much of the belief that when you are building new homes, as you do even in the middle of cities where sites become available, uses change, they have more chance of becoming successful places if they're connected to a historical and wider community, a community of people, schools, infrastructure, social history, etc. On that basis, they always say the greenest building is one that already exists. So retrofitting is an essential part of our future. historical buildings tend to have better volumes, better area than modern buildings. That is a strength for them that we need to think of as we tailor our buildings down to a minimum driven by cost imperatives. So, historical building stock is really absolutely essential to the future. And this then leads to the point that we have a vast number of underutilized housing stock in other areas, which infrastructure, things like Crossrail, can bring in and make a much more accessible city. Then you can think about the north of England being better connected, and in the post-COVID work zone, although I've already committed that I believe people should come to work because it's a social, interactive event as well as a productive activity, that actually we could start to use the housing stock in other parts of the country and service the UK economy and the UK society better. So retro is the kind of base driver, I think, of the future, but new build will always exist, and to me needs to be essentially brown, not green. That's a personal take.
I think you raised some important points there around the fact that this discussion isn't just on buildings, though. We transport there. As someone who regularly gets the Avanti West Coast line up to Manchester, I can very much support better investment in our trains that would unlock more ability to move into some of those new builds. Just specifically on the adaptation point, though, I mean, how are you guys factoring adaptation into your work and into your thinking?
I think it's been going on for years. So it started off with raising the level of electrical plug points from low level to higher level in areas where flooding was a risk. For organizations like Peabody, it's sustainable drainage, flood defenses, and other things, and so on, as well as thinking about how to maintain the ambient temperature in our homes in the future in particularly warm climates. So it's continuous improvement. It's already happening.
Yeah. I think the thing we haven't mentioned is the importance of green spaces as well. We've done a huge amount of work with Sir Michael Marmot on addressing health inequalities, which Tarek's also kind of mentioned. And all of this is obviously linked, because if you build the right green spaces into particularly new developments, that will help address the kind of mitigate some of the impacts we're talking about, improve health inequalities as well, and reduce the need for greater power consumption. The place I live in, Harlesden, in northwest London, was actually featured on the BBC last summer as the kind of a epicenter of heat. I forgot what they call it, heat sinking, where they've got basically too many buildings and not enough green spaces, which was making us all very hot. So I kind of feel it firsthand, but that kind of importance of green space and public space is really important as well.
Great, thanks, Pete. The title for this session obviously had innovative finance models in it, and we've had a question come in on what successful financing models can the UK copy from abroad. So we touched off PLF and how we're seeing that work in the US. The question is specifically around large-scale residential solar, but just to make it a bit more wide than that, what successful financing models are you seeing abroad that you would like to see the UK start to bring in? Tracy, I wonder if I can come to you first.
Yeah, it's not necessarily abroad specifically, although it has been done abroad. I think some of the sort of really inspiring stuff I'm seeing is around energy as a service and subscription models, that kind of thing. Really interesting to read about Octopus and the retrofit they did of a Victorian terraced home in Walthamstow recently on part of their Zero Bills campaign. But also SMS have done a pilot with one of the Oxfordshire councils where they offered residents energy insights and gave them an illustration of what a solar and battery install could do for them. Offered them a subscription service at £40 per month, with the average reduction on energy bills at £90 per month. So it really made sense, and unsurprisingly they saw a 65% take up of that offering. Now it is just a pilot and it'll be capped at 450, but it's those kind of models I think are really, really inspiring.
Thanks, Tracy. Anyone else wants to?
I don't know, it's interesting you're talking a lot about air quality and overheating and elderly people in the summer. The traditional model that the government works with is elderly people in the winter and fuel tax. And in fact, so all that highlights to me is we actually need, and you talk about finance being complicated, we need to make buildings simpler. Everything's disappearing into an app. We have an aging population, people like me who aren't that keen on apps. I mean, we do make the world very techno-driven. And in fact, we build very complicated buildings for sophisticated clients, and then we find they're not using them properly either. So I think we're building endless BMWs rather than Citroën de Cheveurs. And we need to find a point where buildings are simple and function because they've got good thermal mass, they absorb heat in the day, they release it back during the night. You know, the great quote was technology the answer, but what was the question? Everything's being answered by technology. Actually, we need to think more about the base product being a simple, productive, generous suite of volumes where people can live in different ways together to the different temperature requirements that they have, and not kind of standardize everything to one fits all. It's tricky.
Thanks, Simon. Well, I've been given my 5-minute warning, so thanks everyone who's sent questions in. Sorry if we didn't answer your question, but you could come and grab our panelists afterwards and try to ask them directly. Guys, thanks so much for all your insights. Just one final question from me then. What's the one main thing that you want to see happen over the next year to unlock the capital that we need in the UK to green our building stock, both existing and new builds? Tracy, I wonder if I could start with you and then work our way down.
Sure. So when I was thinking about this question, I think it's not necessarily unlocking capital, but driving additional demand. So I think for me, if it were my top on my wish list would be decoupling the electricity and gas pricing. And I know that's a lot easier said than done. But even for instances where people can afford those upfront costs, for things like heat pumps, for example, where it's not always obvious that there will be a huge saving on their energy bills, or the payback periods are particularly long, that would really help to remove that barrier. And I know work is being done on it. The government are looking at alternative energy markets and stuff at the moment. It is a lot easier said than done. But there was a Mitsubishi report that came out recently, which they found that 44% of their respondents said that if electricity prices were cheaper, they would install a heat pump either immediately or would seriously consider it. So it shows what kind of barrier that is.
Thanks, Tracy. Simon.
I bought a diesel car 15 years ago with a £2,500 subsidy for buying it, and I'm now being fined £18 a day to move it, although I know the embodied carbon in that car is best kept on the road rather than taking it out. I'd actually like to see a taking stock of what good might be, rather than another suite of regulations pushing us in a new direction, which is dynamic. I'm interested in much more surveying what good looks like than piling in, because I think we're getting unhealthily over-regulated in a way that's making it unable to deliver, and we need a more open attitude that good is different in different ways in different places over time. So I'm sort of in the stand back and do more research and look at the different models coming forward, because it's just too dynamic at the moment.
Thanks, Simon.
From a financial markets point of view and a financing point of view, I would like to see a reversal in the dynamic, whereby currently there are more hoops to jump through and more complex documentation to get green finance, and then the cost saving is really quite wafer thin, than it is to do traditional finance. The burden of proof I'd like flipped the other way around, so that you have to prove why you shouldn't be penalized for not being green rather than rewarded for being green.
Thanks, Tarek. Pete.
Agree with the panel, particularly some of Tracy's comments about fundamentally there's a huge social need for more investment in this space. I think everyone here would agree with that. The critical point that we're missing at the moment is translating that into sufficiently scalable, investable targets that the likes of Legal and General and NatWest and others can attack at scale to meet the demand that we're all convinced exists. So working collaboratively with government, as I say, it could look like a partnership where grant is combined with patient investment. That there's a role for banks, and there's a role for pension funds, there's a role for housing association. There's a huge social problem. It'll only be solved if we tackle it together, but it's going to require some real strategic coordination to translate that widespread demand into real opportunities.
Thanks, Pete. And just to, I guess, answer my own question, at GFI, that collaboration point is absolutely what we want to see. So any of you here who want to get involved in some of the work we're doing, please do come talk to me afterwards. If anyone from governments here, do continue to work with industry and with the financial institutions to drive forward what it is we all need to achieve. So all that remains is for me to say thanks to all of you for your contributions, for coming along today. You can find out more about what all of our panelists are doing by looking on their websites. You can subscribe to the GFI's Built Environment newsletter, where we give monthly updates on everything we're seeing in the market. But can I just get a final thank you and round of applause for our wonderful panel today?